Hey guys, tonight we're taking a gentle slide back through the mists of time, not to a grand battlefield or a bustling forum, but to the opulent, silk-draped chambers of a rather unusual Roman emperor. Imagine, if you will, the soft glow of oil lamps dancing on shimmering fabrics, the hushed rustle of silk as you move through dimly lit corridors. You're not quite sure if it's a dream or reality, but you're there, enveloped in a world of unparalleled luxury and, frankly, some truly odd choices. Tonight, we're stepping into the surprisingly cozy, yet utterly bewildering life of Elagabalus, the Roman emperor who only wore silk. You probably won't survive a single day in his court without at least one social faux pas, or perhaps a permanent case of bewildered bemusement. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see how far these sleepy historical tales travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our story begins not in Rome, but far to the east, in the ancient Syrian city of Emesa, modern-day Homs. Here, amidst the shimmering heat and the aroma of exotic spices, a young boy named Varius Avitus Bassianus was born around 203 AD. He wasn't your typical Roman noble, destined for a life of military glory or senatorial intrigue. Oh no, Varius came from a family deeply embedded in the religious life of Emesa. His grandmother, Julia Misa, was the sister of the powerful Empress Julia Domna, wife of Emperor Septimius Severus. So, you see, he had connections, like that weird uncle who somehow knows everyone, but in this case, it's a very powerful, politically savvy grandmother. The family held hereditary priesthood to the local sun god, Elagabal. This wasn't just any god. Elagabal was personified by a massive, conical black stone, possibly a meteorite, worshipped with fervent devotion. Think of it as the ultimate rock star, but it's actually a rock. Varius, even as a young boy, was the high priest of this very important deity. You can picture him, even as a child, draped in robes, participating in elaborate ceremonies, his life already set on a path vastly different from the toga-clad senators of Rome. He likely spent his days steeped in ritual, surrounded by incense and the chanting of hymns, probably learning to project a serene, almost otherworldly calm, a skill that would later both captivate and confound the Roman world. Now, Rome in the early 3rd century AD was a bit of a mess. After the assassination of Emperor Caracalla, Varius's cousin, there was a brief, chaotic reign by Macrinus, a Praetorian prefect who, frankly, wasn't very popular. Julia Misa, that formidable grandmother we mentioned, saw her chance. She was a master manipulator, a political chess grandmaster who could probably outwit a modern-day reality TV producer. She concocted a brilliant, if slightly audacious, plan. She spread rumors that Varius, her grandson, was actually Caracalla's illegitimate son. You see, family ties were everything, even if you had to stretch the truth a little or perhaps a lot. Historians still argue whether there was any truth to this claim, or if it was pure fabrication, a desperate gamble by a woman determined to regain her family's power. It's like discovering your distant relative is actually a famous pop star's secret love child. Utterly unbelievable, but just compelling enough to get people talking. The Roman legions stationed in Syria, still loyal to the Severan dynasty and perhaps tired of Macrinus's dull leadership, bought into this story hook, line, and sinker. They were persuaded that this young priest, Varius, was the legitimate heir. On May 16, 218 AD, they proclaimed him emperor. Can you imagine? One day you're sacrificing to a sun god, the next you're being hailed as the ruler of the most powerful empire in the world. It's quite the career change. Varius, now taking the name Elagabalus in honor of his god, was suddenly thrust onto the grandest stage imaginable. He was still just a teenager, perhaps 14 or 15 years old. Most kids his age were worried about their next meal or avoiding chores. He was planning a civil war. Macrinus, predictably, was not thrilled with this development. A battle ensued and Macrinus was defeated and killed. So, with the path cleared, the young Elagabalus began his long, slow journey from the desert sands of Syria to the marble halls of Rome. This wasn't a quick hop on a charter flight. This was a year-long procession, a moving spectacle of imperial power and religious fervor. As you picture him, adorned in the finest silks Emesa could offer, leading his procession towards the heart of the Roman Empire, you can almost hear the murmuring of the crowds, the clatter of hooves, and the soft, almost hypnotic rustle of fabric. It's the sound of a new, utterly unique, and profoundly silky chapter in Roman history beginning. As you travel with our young emperor, Elagabalus, on his slow, deliberate journey from the sun-baked plains of Syria towards the grandeur of Rome, you might start to notice something rather peculiar about his entourage. It's not just the sheer number of people, the soldiers, the advisors, the servants. It's the very essence of the procession. This isn't a typical Roman triumph, all clanking armor and stoic faces. Oh no, this is something else entirely. Elagabalus, remember, was first and foremost a high priest, and his god Elagabal was coming with him. And by coming with him, I mean the massive, sacred black stone itself, mounted on a chariot, adorned with gold and jewels, essentially given VIP treatment. Imagine the scene: the dusty roads of Asia Minor, then the arduous crossing into Europe, and everywhere they go, this sacred rock. It's like taking your favorite, incredibly heavy, inanimate mascot on a cross-country road trip, but with vastly more religious significance and significantly less air conditioning. Elagabalus, in his role as chief priest, would often walk backward in front of the chariot, his eyes fixed on the stone, his robes swirling. This was a profound act of reverence, but to a traditional Roman, it might have looked, well, a little odd. Most emperors preferred to face forward, to see where they were going and to acknowledge the cheering, or sometimes silently judging, crowds. This backward walk was one of the first subtle hints that this new emperor wasn't going to be playing by the traditional Roman rulebook. The cult of Elagabal was vibrant, ecstatic, and rather unconventional by Roman standards. Its worship involved elaborate rituals, vibrant music, and sometimes public displays that would make a seasoned Roman senator raise a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. Unlike the Roman pantheon, which had a god for almost everything. Seriously, there was probably a minor deity for lost socks. Elagabal was a singular, all-encompassing solar deity. This monotheistic tendency, even if it wasn't strictly so, felt alien to the Romans, who were used to a buffet of gods to choose from. Historians still argue whether Elagabalus genuinely intended to replace Jupiter as the supreme deity of Rome, or merely elevate his god to a prominent, perhaps even co-equal, status. Was it religious zeal or political ambition? Perhaps a silky blend of both. As the procession wound its way through various provinces, word would have preceded them. Whispers of a young, effeminate emperor, obsessed with an eastern sun god, wearing robes that shimmered like water, would have rippled through the empire. For the average Roman citizen, their mental image of an emperor was a stoic figure in a toga, perhaps leading legions or dedicating a temple. Now picture this: Elagabalus, often adorned in flowing, brightly colored silks, performing rites to a strange black stone. It would be like expecting a formal classical concert and getting a psychedelic rock opera instead. One quirky tidbit about this journey is the sheer logistics involved in moving such a sacred and prominent object. The black stone, likely a basalt meteorite, was quite large. It wasn't something you just tossed in the back of a cart. Special chariots, likely adorned themselves, were needed. Imagine the team of engineers and laborers, meticulously planning each leg of the journey, ensuring the god rock made it safely. You can almost hear the grumbling from the engineers. Right, another 3 miles and then we need to reinforce the bridge for the big rock. Hope no one decided to park their donkey cart in the way. It was a monumental undertaking, symbolizing the supreme importance Elagabalus placed on his deity, even before he set foot in Rome. This wasn't just a religious belief, it was the foundation of his identity and, as it would turn out, his reign. The journey itself was a rolling sermon, a living advertisement for the new imperial cult. And with every mile, the anticipation, or perhaps apprehension, in Rome would have grown. You've been with Elagabalus and his peculiar silk-swathed entourage for what feels like an eternity, slowly inching closer to the beating heart of the Roman Empire. Now, imagine that final leg of the journey, the anticipation building with every step. As you approach the city limits of Rome, the sheer scale of the capital begins to reveal itself. The distant murmur of the vast metropolis grows into a thrumming symphony of human activity. The Appian Way, usually bustling with merchants and legionaries, would have been cleared, ready for the arrival of its new unconventional emperor. The actual entry into Rome was, by all accounts, a spectacle that defied traditional expectations. This wasn't the stoic, triumphant general on his warhorse, bedecked in laurel. Oh no. Elagabalus made his grand entrance not on horseback, but in a chariot, drawing the sacred black stone of Elagabal. And as he rode, you, the observer, would have been struck by his attire. He wasn't wearing the traditional Roman toga or senatorial purple. Instead, he was likely swathed in rich, flowing silks, perhaps embroidered with gold, shimmering under the Mediterranean sun. It was an aesthetic statement, a declaration that this emperor was fundamentally different. It was less "Hail Caesar," and more "Look what the desert wind blew in." The reaction of the Roman populace would have been a fascinating mix. Curiosity, certainly. Whispers of his eccentricities had surely preceded him. But there would also have been a profound sense of bewilderment, perhaps even unease. For centuries, Roman emperors had presented themselves as the embodiment of Roman virtue, practicality, and martial prowess. Elagabalus, with his priestly robes, his exotic god, and his distinctly non-Roman appearance, challenged all of those deeply ingrained notions. It was like expecting a stern headmaster and getting a flamboyant performance artist instead. And while Rome was a cosmopolitan city, accustomed to foreign gods and customs, seeing them at the very pinnacle of power was a different matter entirely. One mainstream historical fact to grasp here is that this grand entrance marked the formal beginning of his reign within Rome, cementing his authority after the defeat of Macrinus. It was a crucial moment of political theater, designed to impress and subdue. However, the quirky tidbit is how much attention was paid to the clothing he wore on this momentous occasion. The historians of the time, often biased against him, made sure to highlight his barbaric and effeminate attire. It wasn't just that he wore silk, it was how he wore it in defiance of Roman sartorial norms that really irked the traditionalists. Imagine turning up to a black tie gala in a neon pink disco suit. That's the level of fashion shock we're talking about, but with imperial consequences. Historians still argue whether his choice of dress was a deliberate, provocative statement to undermine Roman traditions, or simply an expression of his deeply ingrained Syrian identity and religious devotion. Was it a calculated political move, or just a young man genuinely more comfortable in the clothes he grew up wearing, clothes that also served as his priestly vestments? The answer probably lies somewhere in the silken folds of that debate. You can almost hear the old Roman senators grumbling in hushed tones, adjusting their perfectly starched togas, and wondering what on earth they had just witnessed. They were about to find out that the silk was just the beginning. Now that our young, silk-clad Emperor Elagabalus has made his rather unconventional debut in Rome, let's talk about the fabric that would come to define his reign: silk. Before Elagabalus, silk was already a status symbol of the highest order in Rome. It wasn't just clothing, it was a whisper of distant lands, a shimmering testament to unimaginable wealth, and a subtle flex of imperial power. Imagine trying to buy a single thread of it, you'd probably need to sell a small villa. The Romans had a complicated relationship with silk. On one hand, they absolutely adored its luxurious feel, its soft drape, and its lustrous sheen. It was so fine that it felt like a second skin, unlike the coarser wool and linen they were accustomed to. On the other hand, it came from the mysterious East, specifically China, a place so far away it might as well have been the moon. This meant it was incredibly, astronomically expensive. We're talking about prices that would make a modern-day luxury car seem like a bargain. Pliny the Elder, a Roman writer, famously lamented that silk cost its weight in gold. Given the light nature of silk, that's quite a lot of gold for a toga or a tunic. So, for most Romans, silk was an aspirational fabric, something seen on the truly elite, perhaps an empress or a particularly wealthy senator, and even then usually blended with other fibers or used as trim. It was a fleeting glimpse of opulence, a rare sight. You might see a splash of it on a courtesan or an actor, adding to their allure, but never, ever on a proper Roman citizen engaging in their daily duties. And certainly not, under any normal circumstances, as the primary fabric for everything an emperor wore. It just wasn't done. It was like wearing a ball gown to a wrestling match. One mainstream historical fact about Roman silk is that much of it arrived via the Silk Road, a vast network of trade routes connecting east and west. This wasn't a single paved highway, but a sprawling, perilous journey across deserts and mountains, rife with bandits and extreme weather. Every inch of that journey added to the cost and mystique of the fabric. The Romans didn't even fully understand how silk was made. They knew it came from worms, or rather a type of worm, a silkworm. But the intricate process of sericulture, the raising of silkworms and reeling of silk, remained a closely guarded Chinese secret for centuries. It was almost mythical, enhancing its allure. A quirky tidbit here is that despite its popularity, Roman moralists often railed against silk, particularly for men. They saw it as effeminate, corrupting, and a sign of excessive luxury that would undermine traditional Roman values of austerity and manliness. Seneca, a famous philosopher, complained that garments of silk are no protection either for the body or for modesty. He thought it was too revealing, too soft, too un-Roman. Imagine being so upset about someone's fashion choices that you write an entire philosophical treatise on it. It's like a Roman version of a fashion blogger rant, but with significantly more gravitas. Historians still argue whether these moral condemnations truly reflected widespread public opinion or were merely the grumblings of a conservative elite who felt threatened by changing social norms and conspicuous consumption. But Elagabalus? He didn't just wear silk. He lived in silk. He probably slept in silk, ate off silk, and, knowing his penchant for extravagance, might have even tried to train his pet lions to wear silk bibs. He wasn't just breaking fashion norms, he was pulverizing them with a silken sledgehammer. His approach was a complete disregard for the traditional Roman anxieties about wealth, gender, and imperial decorum. And this casual, almost defiant, embrace of silk was about to redefine what it meant to be emperor, at least for a very short, very luxurious period. Now, let's pull back the curtain on Elagabalus's imperial wardrobe. Forget everything you thought you knew about Roman fashion, particularly for an emperor. You're probably picturing a dignified figure in a stately toga, perhaps with a subtle purple stripe for senatorial rank. But when you look at Elagabalus, you're not seeing that at all. Instead, you're observing a walking, breathing, shimmering textile exhibition. Elagabalus wasn't merely fond of silk. He was obsessed. His personal collection of silken garments was legendary, even in an age of imperial excess. We're talking about an emperor who reportedly refused to wear anything but silk. This wasn't just for special occasions or courtly ceremonies. This was his everyday attire. From the moment he awoke until he finally drifted off to sleep, he was enveloped in the soft, luxurious embrace of silk. Imagine trying to keep that clean in ancient Rome without dry cleaning services. His laundry bill alone must have been more than the annual budget of a small province. His robes weren't just plain silk either. Accounts suggest they were often intricately embroidered with gold thread, sometimes adorned with pearls and precious stones. Think of it as haute couture, but on an imperial scale, designed to defy every Roman convention of masculine dignity and imperial sobriety. He reportedly owned tunics of pure silk, dyed in vibrant, almost shocking colors like saffron yellow, deep Tyrian purple, which was already astronomically expensive on its own, and brilliant green. He often wore a series of transparent silken cloaks, layered over each other, creating a shimmering, ethereal effect. You can almost hear the gasps from the traditionalists, clutching their sensible wool togas in dismay. One mainstream historical fact to consider here is that silk, even for the wealthiest Romans, was usually blended with other fibers like linen or wool to make it more affordable and durable. Pure silk garments were exceedingly rare. Elagabalus, however, insisted on pure silk. This wasn't just about luxury, it was a defiant statement, a rejection of Roman norms, and an embrace of Eastern decadence as perceived by his critics. He wasn't just wearing clothes, he was wearing an ideology. A particularly quirky tidbit revolves around his footwear. Not content with silk robes, Elagabalus was said to have worn soft, silken slippers, often adorned with jewels, even in contexts where practical, sturdy Roman sandals would have been expected. Imagine him inspecting troops in the field or riding in a parade, not in military boots, but in delicate, gem-encrusted silk slippers. It's like turning up to a construction site in fluffy bunny slippers. Historians still argue whether some of these accounts were exaggerated by his hostile biographers, eager to paint him as completely depraved and un-Roman. Was every detail truly accurate, or were they just spinning a good yarn, a silken lie, if you will, to further tarnish his reputation? But regardless of the exact number of silk tunics or pairs of slippers, the point remains. Elagabalus used his wardrobe as a powerful tool of self-expression and provocation. He pushed boundaries not just in terms of expense, but in terms of gender roles and cultural identity, daring the Roman elite to look away from his shimmering, utterly non-traditional presence. He was saying, without a single word, "I am different, and I will rule in my own way, no matter how much it upsets your sense of propriety." And for a society as obsessed with appearances and status as ancient Rome, this fashion statement was as loud as a legionary trumpet. With Elagabalus, the sheer volume of silk wasn't confined to his wardrobe. It spilled over into every aspect of his imperial life, including, perhaps most famously, his legendary banquets. You've probably heard stories of Roman feasts, overflowing with exotic foods and flowing wine, but Elagabalus took culinary excess to an entirely new and distinctly silken level. Imagine, if you will, being invited to dine at his palace. You're not just walking into a dining hall, you're entering a sensory wonderland, a place where luxury was not just seen but felt, smelled, and tasted, often with a generous side of the absurd. The dining rooms themselves were likely draped in silk. Curtains of shimmering fabric might have adorned the windows, perhaps even canopies of silk suspended above the dining couches. The cushions you reclined on? Undoubtedly silk, perhaps embroidered with gold or silver thread. Even the tablecloths, if they bothered with them at all, would have been the finest, softest silk available. It was an environment designed to be utterly immersive, a cocoon of luxury. And for the ancient Roman, accustomed to more practical, albeit grand, dining spaces, this would have been an overwhelming display of opulence. It's like walking into a modern-day five-star restaurant that decided to redecorate entirely with silk sheets and pillowcases. Now let's talk about the food itself. While the menu might have featured standard Roman delicacies, it was the presentation that truly set Elagabalus apart. He famously served dishes piled high with exotic ingredients, some of which were so rare they were almost mythical. Think nightingale tongues, parrot heads, or flamingo brains. And yes, sometimes these dishes were presented on platters lined with silk, or served with silken napkins so fine they were practically gossamer. One particularly quirky tidbit is the account of him serving guests dishes of pearls, not as food, but as a demonstration of wealth, sometimes dissolving them in vinegar to drink. That's next-level conspicuous consumption right there. You might have left hungry, but you certainly wouldn't forget the presentation. But the silk wasn't just for decoration or the serving of food. Even the servants were often dressed in elaborate silken attire. Imagine a legion of attendants, moving silently through the dining hall, their robes rustling softly, reflecting the candlelight. This wasn't just about showing off, it was about creating an atmosphere, an experience where every element contributed to the overwhelming sense of luxury and the emperor's boundless resources. It was a form of performance art, with the emperor as the lead impresario. A mainstream historical fact often overlooked in the sensational accounts of Elagabalus's feasts is that Roman dining was already a highly ritualized and performative affair. Banquets were not just about eating, they were social events, opportunities to display status, forge alliances, and engage in philosophical discussions, or sometimes drunken revelry. Elagabalus simply pushed these existing boundaries to an extreme, leveraging every element, including the fabric on the table, to project his unique brand of imperial power. Historians still argue whether his banquets were genuinely so outlandish, or if many of the more extreme tales were fabrications or exaggerations by hostile biographers eager to demonize him as a decadent, effeminate, and therefore unfit ruler. Was he truly serving dishes of pearls, or were his detractors merely pearl-clutching at his extravagance? Regardless, the imagery of his silken feasts has endured, a testament to the unforgettable, if uncomfortable, luxury he embodied. As you continue your deep dive into the silken world of Elagabalus, you can't ignore perhaps the most controversial and, to his Roman contemporaries, shocking aspect of his personal life: his gender expression and how silk played a central role in it. While today we have a far more nuanced understanding of gender identity and expression, for the Romans of the 3rd century AD, Elagabalus's behavior was utterly bewildering, scandalous, and often seen as a direct challenge to their deeply ingrained patriarchal norms. Elagabalus openly embraced a fluidity of gender that was revolutionary and profoundly unsettling to Roman society. He often presented himself in ways that were considered feminine, not just in his choice of clothing, but in his demeanor and personal relationships. He preferred to be called domina, mistress, rather than dominus, master, by his male lovers. He reportedly walked with a swaying gait, wore makeup, and plucked his body hair, all practices associated with Roman women or effeminate men, particularly actors and dancers, who were often looked down upon. And this is where the silk truly comes into play beyond mere luxury. For Elagabalus, silk wasn't just expensive fabric. It was a medium of personal expression, a tactile rejection of rigid Roman masculinity. While Roman men wore wool and linen, seen as robust and appropriate for a warrior society, silk was associated with the East, with softness, with luxury, and crucially with women. By choosing to wear nothing but silk, often in vibrant, translucent layers, he was quite literally embodying a gender nonconformity that sent shockwaves through the conservative Roman elite. It was a visual rebellion, a shimmering two-fingered salute to traditional Roman values. One mainstream historical fact to grasp is that Roman society placed immense value on virtus, a concept encompassing manliness, courage, and moral excellence. For an emperor, the embodiment of virtus was paramount. Elagabalus's perceived effeminacy, exacerbated by his silken wardrobe, was seen as a profound failure of virtus, rendering him unfit to rule in the eyes of many. It was a cultural clash of epic proportions, a silent but screaming indictment of Roman expectations. A particularly quirky tidbit comes from the historical accounts, admittedly hostile, which claim that Elagabalus often dressed as a woman, appearing in public not just in women's clothing, but also with wigs and makeup, and even working in taverns or brothels, posing as a prostitute. While the veracity of these extreme claims is highly debatable, remember, His biographers wanted him to look as bad as possible. They highlight the depth of the perceived scandal and the lengths to which he was seen to challenge gender norms. Historians still argue whether these accounts are literal truths, malicious slanders, or perhaps an attempt to interpret Elagabalus's gender fluidity through the narrow, judgmental lens of Roman morality. Was he truly a cross-dresser in the modern sense, or were his lavish Eastern robes and effeminate mannerisms simply interpreted as such by a deeply prejudiced Roman elite? Regardless of the precise truth behind every lurid detail, what is clear is that Elagabalus used his appearance, and particularly his ubiquitous silk, to defy the expectations of his time. He was a Roman emperor who refused to conform to the image of what a Roman emperor should be, especially in how he presented himself. And in doing so, he became one of history's most fascinating, if deeply misunderstood, figures in the annals of gender expression, shrouded, as always, in shimmering silk. Beyond his scandalous fashion choices and gender fluidity, Elagabalus's most profound and provocative departure from Roman norms lay in his role as a priest. You see, while Roman emperors often held religious titles like Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of the Roman state religion, this was typically a political role, a formal duty alongside their military and administrative responsibilities. It was less about fervent personal devotion and more about maintaining social order and tradition. Elagabalus, however, was a priest first and an emperor second, or perhaps simultaneously. His entire worldview was shaped by the cult of Elagabal, his beloved sun god. When he arrived in Rome, he wasn't just bringing himself, he was bringing his god literally. The giant black stone, the symbol of Elagabal, was installed on the Palatine Hill, in a magnificent new temple built specifically for it. This grand structure, known as the Elagabalium, wasn't just a temple. It was intended to be the temple, the new spiritual center of Rome, perhaps even superseding the venerable temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline. Imagine the Roman equivalent of Westminster Abbey suddenly being told it's just a quaint old building next to the new, must-see megachurch. Elagabalus himself performed daily rituals to Elagabal, often in public, dressed in his elaborate silken robes, which were also his priestly vestments. These ceremonies were alien to Roman eyes. They involved ecstatic dances, Eastern music, and even self-flagellation by his Syrian priests. Roman state religion, while deeply ingrained in daily life, was generally more formal, less outwardly passionate, and certainly didn't involve the emperor dancing in public in front of a giant black rock. It was a fusion of imperial power and religious zeal that felt deeply uncomfortable to the Roman establishment. One mainstream historical fact here is that Elagabalus attempted to integrate other Roman gods into the worship of Elagabal, essentially making them subservient. He even arranged a marriage between Elagabal and the goddess Urania, the Carthaginian goddess Tanit, identified with the Roman Caelestis, whose sacred image was brought from Carthage for the ceremony. This wasn't just a quirky tidbit, it was a profound theological and political statement, attempting to reshape the very pantheon of Roman deities around his supreme sun god. It was like saying, Jupiter, you're fine, but you're just a bridesmaid to Elagabal's glorious wedding. A particularly quirky tidbit is the accounts of Elagabalus parading the sacred stone through the streets of Rome, pulled by 6 white horses, with the emperor himself running backward in front of it, guiding the horses. This was not merely an act of piety, it was a deeply symbolic and highly visible act of humility before his god, something almost unheard of for a Roman emperor. Historians still argue whether his fervent religious devotion was genuine, a calculated political maneuver to consolidate power by imposing a new state religion, or simply the bizarre manifestation of a young man caught between 2 vastly different cultures. Was he a true believer, a shrewd manipulator, or just a terribly misunderstood teenager with a rock fetish? The truth, like his silken robes, remains multifaceted and somewhat translucent. As Elagabalus settled into his peculiar reign in Rome, draped in silk and consumed by his sun god, His court rapidly became a magnet for an equally curious collection of characters. You might expect an emperor's inner circle to be filled with seasoned senators, grizzled military commanders, and wise philosophers. But Elagabalus predictably did things differently. His court was less a bastion of Roman tradition and more a vibrant, often scandalous, melting pot of personalities, drawn from both the east and the less conventional corners of Roman society. Imagine stepping into the imperial palace, and instead of stern-faced officials, you encounter a flamboyant array of individuals. There were undoubtedly some traditional Roman aristocrats attempting to curry favor or simply survive, but they would have been overshadowed by Elagabalus's personal choices. His advisors weren't necessarily chosen for their administrative prowess or military acumen. Instead, he favored those who shared his tastes, his religious fervor, or simply amused him. Among the most prominent figures was his grandmother, Julia Misa, that shrewd political operator who orchestrated his rise to power. While Elagabalus was the emperor, she was often seen as the power behind the throne, pulling strings and managing the more mundane and probably more Roman aspects of governance. She was the steady hand, if a manipulative one, guiding the ship while her grandson sailed off on a silken cloud. You can almost hear her sighing exasperatedly, "Oh, Elagabalus, not more peacocks at dinner. And please just one day in a toga?" Then there were his various companions and lovers. Elagabalus was openly bisexual and had a succession of male and female partners. Most notably, he reportedly married a former slave and charioteer named Hierocles, whom he elevated to a position of immense power, even calling him his husband. This was incredibly scandalous in Roman society, where such open displays of same-sex relationships, particularly with a former slave and with imperial sanction, were deeply frowned upon, especially for a public figure. You can just imagine the Roman equivalent of tabloids having an absolute field day with this. A mainstream historical fact is that Roman emperors often relied on freedmen, former slaves, for administrative duties, but Elagabalus took this to an extreme, elevating individuals based on personal favor rather than merit or traditional background. This further alienated the old Roman aristocracy, who saw their traditional pathways to power being circumvented by these new money types, or worse, by individuals deemed socially inferior. A quirky tidbit that exemplifies the unusual nature of his court is the anecdote about Elagabalus appointing a council of women, called the Cenaculum, to decide matters of fashion, etiquette, and social precedence within the imperial court. While Roman women held significant informal power, a formal body like this, specifically for women's affairs, and presided over by the emperor himself, was unheard of and deeply ridiculed by male historians. Imagine a modern head of state convening a committee solely to decide on the proper length of a tie. Historians still argue whether this cenaculum was a genuine, albeit eccentric, attempt to empower women in a limited sphere, or simply another example of Elagabalus's whimsical disregard for established norms, designed to further mock the traditional male-dominated Senate. Was it proto-feminism or just another imperial joke? Perhaps, like everything with Elagabalus, it was a bit of both, shrouded in silk and scandal. As Elagabalus paraded his silken finery and unconventional ways through Rome, the city's response was, as you might imagine, far from uniform. You weren't just dealing with senators grumbling in their togas. You were witnessing a profound shift in public perception, a slow but steady erosion of imperial authority driven by shock, bewilderment, and often outright disgust. Initially, there might have been a sense of novelty, even fascination. A new emperor, so young, so exotic, so different. But as his reign progressed and his behavior became increasingly divorced from traditional Roman expectations, that fascination curdled into something far more dangerous: contempt. The Roman populace, though accustomed to a certain level of imperial eccentricity, had a deep-seated respect for tradition, for the mos maiorum, the customs of their ancestors. Elagabalus seemed to delight in flouting every single one of them. Imagine the average Roman citizen, perhaps a legionary veteran, a hard-working merchant, or a humble baker. They valued strength, piety in the Roman sense, meaning proper observance of rituals, and a certain gravitas in their leaders. When they saw their emperor dressing in translucent silks, dancing in public to foreign music, and dedicating himself to a strange black stone, it wasn't just a fashion faux pas. It was an insult to their very identity as Romans. It chipped away at the dignity of the imperial office itself. It was like seeing your country's revered leader suddenly decide to conduct state business while wearing a clown suit. One mainstream historical fact that highlights this growing disillusionment is the widespread discontent among the Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers tasked with protecting the emperor. These were tough, traditional Roman soldiers, and they found Elagabalus's effeminate style and religious fanaticism deeply unsettling. They were the muscle of the empire, and when the muscle starts to get twitchy, it's a very bad sign for the man on the throne. They were more concerned with martial prowess and Roman order than with silk fashion shows or bizarre religious ceremonies. A quirky tidbit that illustrates the public's perception of his extravagance comes from accounts of his generosity, which sometimes bordered on the bizarre. He reportedly gave away vast sums of money, not always to the deserving, but sometimes in whimsical ways, like scattering gold coins from towers or throwing expensive gifts into crowds. While this might sound fun, it further cemented his image as frivolous and wasteful, rather than a responsible steward of the empire's resources. Imagine him tossing rare silk-woven tapestries from a balcony during a parade. Catch Rome. It's another one. Historians still argue whether his public antics were purely for personal amusement, a genuine attempt to endear himself to the populace, or a desperate cry for attention from a young man overwhelmed by the demands of his position. Was he truly so oblivious to Roman sensibilities, or was he deliberately trying to provoke them, pushing the boundaries to see how far he could go before the breaking point? The whispers in the streets turned into murmurs, and the murmurs into outright discontent. The Roman elite, particularly the Senate, found him utterly intolerable. His behavior undermined their authority, their traditions, and their very concept of what it meant to be a Roman. The stage was being set for a dramatic and ultimately tragic conclusion to the reign of the emperor who only wore silk. The soft rustle of his robes was increasingly drowned out by the growing discontent of a deeply offended empire. As Elagabalus continued his reign, his obsession with silk wasn't confined to his personal wardrobe or lavish banquets. You might imagine that even an emperor, no matter how eccentric, would draw a line somewhere. But Elagabalus, with his boundless creativity for extravagance, seemed determined to integrate his beloved fabric into the very structures of Rome, attempting to weave silk into the city's grand tapestry of architecture and public works. While there aren't many surviving examples of silk directly used as a building material, ancient Roman concrete was a bit too rough for delicate fabric. Thank goodness. Accounts suggest Elagabalus's influence extended to how imperial spaces were decorated and conceived. Imagine walking into one of his newly renovated imperial villas or sections of the palace. Instead of the usual stark marble or painted frescoes, you might have encountered entire rooms draped in silk. Think of silk tapestries covering walls, or elaborate silk hangings separating spaces, creating private, shimmering alcoves. It would have transformed the cold, hard grandeur of Roman architecture into something far softer, more intimate, and undeniably more luxurious. It was less about structural integrity and more about creating an immersive, sensory experience, turning stone into a backdrop for fabric. He reportedly used silk for the awnings and coverings in public spaces and arenas, not just for practical shade but for sheer aesthetic impact. Picture the Colosseum, not under a rough canvas velarium, but under a massive, shimmering silk canopy, perhaps dyed purple or gold, casting a soft, ethereal light over the gladiatorial contests. It would have been an unprecedented sight, a fleeting moment of dazzling, impractical beauty. You can almost hear the collective gasp of the crowd, followed by a confused murmur. Is that silk? Aren't we a bit overdressed for a tiger fight? One mainstream historical fact to note is that Roman emperors often engaged in massive building projects to legitimize their rule and leave a lasting legacy. Augustus built temples, Hadrian built walls and grand villas. Elagabalus built temples to his god, but his architectural contributions were often focused on temporary or decorative elements, emphasizing lavish display over enduring utility. His attempts to incorporate silk into architectural settings were an extension of his overall philosophy, fleeting beauty and sensory indulgence over traditional Roman permanence and gravitas. A particularly quirky tidbit comes from the accounts of his use of exotic materials, including gold dust and precious stones, mixed into the mortar of some walls or sprinkled onto floors in his private residences. While not strictly silk, this shows a similar mindset, the desire to infuse every surface with extravagant, ephemeral luxury. Imagine walking on a floor that literally glittered with gold, only to realize it was designed to be quickly worn away by footsteps. Historians still argue whether these extreme forms of decoration were purely for his own pleasure, an attempt to replicate the legendary opulence of Eastern palaces, or a desperate effort to distract from his unpopular policies and controversial personal life. Was it true imperial vision, or just a very expensive form of magpie syndrome? You're left to wonder if the construction crews just sighed and got on with sprinkling the gold, knowing it would be a fleeting luxury. You've seen Elagabalus's silk-drenched dining rooms and his attempts to infuse architecture with his unique brand of luxury. Now, let's take you to one of ancient Rome's most beloved spectacles, the chariot races. These were not just sporting events, they were massive public festivals, a chance for Romans from all walks of life to gather, cheer, gamble, and forget their daily woes. And true to form, Elagabalus managed to inject his silken obsession even into this roaring, dusty arena. Imagine the Circus Maximus, packed with hundreds of thousands of screaming fans. The air crackles with excitement, the scent of dust and sweat hangs heavy, and then a gasp ripples through the crowd. The chariots, usually sturdy, functional vehicles, are transformed. Elagabalus reportedly had his own chariots adorned with silk. Not just a token flag or banner, but perhaps decorative drapes, or even the reins themselves interwoven with fine silk threads. Picture a team of horses thundering around the track, their harnesses gleaming, and the chariot itself shimmering with intricate silken embellishments. It was a spectacle within a spectacle, a flash of unexpected, almost delicate beauty amidst the raw power and danger of the race. His own charioteers, too, might have been dressed in more elaborate silken tunics than the standard functional racing gear. While practical considerations probably limited the full extent of the fabric, you wouldn't want silk snagging in the wheels during a hairpin turn, the visual impact would have been undeniable. It was another way for Elagabalus to imprint his unique aesthetic onto a widely adored public institution. It was like showing up to the Super Bowl not in a jersey, but in a custom-made, sequin tuxedo. You'd certainly get noticed. One mainstream historical fact about Roman chariot racing is its immense popularity across all social strata. It was a unifying force, a shared passion. Emperors often sponsored games to gain favor with the populace. Elagabalus, by lavishing his personal taste on these events, was attempting to connect with the masses, albeit in his own peculiar way. He wasn't just funding the games, he was decorating them, making them distinctly his. A particularly quirky tidbit comes from the accounts of Elagabalus sometimes participating in the races himself, not as a serious competitor, but often in a ceremonial or exhibitionist capacity, sometimes dressed in his signature silken attire. Imagine the emperor perched precariously in a chariot, his silk robes fluttering in the wind, a vision of shimmering impracticality amidst the mud and speed. It must have been a truly bewildering sight for the seasoned chariot fans, who were used to gritty, determined athletes, not a fashion plate. Historians still argue whether his participation was a genuine display of his love for the sport, another bizarre attempt to shock and entertain, or a childish indulgence that further alienated the more serious elements of Roman society? Was it a harmless eccentricity, or a clear sign that he was dangerously out of touch with the realities of imperial rule? The dust settled, but the whispers certainly didn't. As you've journeyed with Elagabalus through his silken world, from his personal attire to his grand banquets and even the chariot races, you've probably started to wonder, where did all this silk come from? Rome, after all, was not known for its silkworms. This brings us to a crucial, often overlooked aspect of the story, the whispers of the Silk Road. The demand for silk, particularly the insatiable demand of an emperor who insisted on wearing nothing else, had profound implications for global trade, even if the Romans didn't fully grasp the vastness of the network that brought it to their doorstep. Imagine the immense journey a single strand of silk undertook before it ever reached Elagabalus's wardrobe. It began thousands of miles away in the distant lands of Serica, ancient China, where the secret of sericulture, the raising of silkworms and the meticulous process of reeling the threads from their cocoons, was a closely guarded national treasure. From there, raw silk or finished fabrics would begin their perilous journey west, traversing the legendary Silk Road. This wasn't a single well-paved highway as we discussed before, but a complex, shifting network of trade routes. Caravans of camels, laden with precious goods, trudged across vast deserts like the Taklamakan, where fierce sandstorms could swallow entire expeditions. They navigated treacherous mountain passes, where bandits lay in wait and endured scorching heat and freezing cold. The journey could take months, even years. Each stop along the way, bustling oasis towns, vibrant trading posts like Samarkand and Bokhara, added another layer of middlemen, another markup, and another story to the fabric's long voyage. One mainstream historical fact is that the Roman Empire had a chronic trade deficit with the East due to its insatiable demand for luxury goods like silk, spices, and precious stones. Vast amounts of Roman gold flowed eastward to pay for these exotic imports. This outflow of currency was a constant source of concern for Roman economists and emperors, who saw their wealth literally slipping away, one silken robe at a time. It's like watching your bank account dwindle because you just can't resist those expensive online impulse buys, but on an imperial scale. A particularly quirky tidbit related to the Silk Road is the legend of how silk eventually made its way out of China. While the details vary, one popular story involves Chinese princesses smuggling silkworm eggs out of the country in their elaborate headdresses or hidden in their hair, often given as gifts to foreign rulers they were marrying. Imagine the pressure. Darling, don't forget your toothbrush, your change of clothes, and oh yes, the future of the entire silk industry subtly woven into your coiffure. Historians still argue about the exact timing and method of how sericulture spread beyond China, with some suggesting it was through espionage, others through gradual cultural diffusion, and still others through accidental discovery. Was it a daring act of industrial espionage or just a really good hair day? Regardless, the eventual spread of silkworm cultivation ultimately diluted Rome's dependence on Chinese imports, but not in Elagabalus's time. So, as Elagabalus reveled in his personal silken paradise, he was unknowingly at the very end of an incredibly long, complex, and dangerous global supply chain. Every rustle of his tunic was a testament to the endurance of merchants, the vastness of empires, and the relentless human desire for luxury, all whispering of the distant, shimmering lands where the silk began its journey. You've seen the silk, you've met the man, and you've understood the world-spanning journey of his favorite fabric. But now, as you settle deeper into your pillow, a sense of unease begins to creep into the narrative. Elagabalus's reign, for all its silken splendor and quirky antics, was ultimately short-lived and ended in dramatic fashion. His defiance of Roman norms, particularly his religious zealotry and perceived effeminacy, rapidly eroded his support base, especially within the powerful Praetorian Guard and among the traditional Roman elite. The patience of the Romans, even their imperial guard, had worn thin. They could tolerate a certain level of imperial quirkiness, but Elagabalus had pushed far beyond their breaking point. His elevation of the god Elagabal above Jupiter, his public cross-dressing and scandalous relationships, and his general disregard for the dignity of the imperial office were seen not just as personal failings, but as dangerous threats to the stability and identity of the Roman Empire. The murmurs of discontent grew louder, transforming into open calls for his removal. His grandmother, Julia Maesa, the same shrewd woman who had brought him to power, soon realized that her grandson was an uncontrollable liability. She understood that if Elagabalus continued on his path, it would not only lead to his downfall but would likely take the entire Severan dynasty with him. So, with ruthless pragmatism, she began to maneuver. She saw that a replacement was needed, someone who could restore a semblance of Roman order and tradition. Her choice fell upon another of her grandsons, Elagabalus's cousin, the much more conventionally Roman and, crucially, much more controllable Alexander Severus. A mainstream historical fact here is that Julia Maesa successfully orchestrated Alexander Severus's adoption by Elagabalus and secured his appointment as Caesar, essentially making him Elagabalus's heir. This was a direct challenge to Elagabalus's authority and a clear signal of the shifting power dynamics within the imperial court. Elagabalus, perhaps sensing the danger or simply growing jealous of Alexander's popularity with the Praetorian Guard, tried to have him removed and even assassinated. But by then it was too late. The Praetorians had made their choice. A particularly quirky tidbit about his downfall is the account of Elagabalus attempting to prepare for his demise. Knowing his life was in peril, he reportedly had various means of suicide prepared for himself, including silken ropes for strangulation and daggers with jeweled handles. He even had a tower built from which he considered throwing himself, but he decided it was too low to ensure death and would spoil his expensive silken robes on impact. This bizarre planning, weighing self-preservation against sartorial dignity, truly encapsulates his peculiar priorities even in the face of death. Historians still argue whether these specific suicide preparations are true or merely illustrative embellishments by hostile writers trying to highlight his perceived cowardice and effeminacy. Was he truly so concerned with preserving his silk, or was it just another scandalous detail added to his already sensational biography? The end came swiftly. On March 11, 222 AD, after a confrontation with the Praetorian Guard, Elagabalus was dragged from his hiding place, likely a latrine, and brutally murdered by the very soldiers who had once proclaimed him emperor. His mother, Julia Soaemias, was also killed. Their bodies were reportedly mutilated, and Elagabalus's body was dragged through the streets of Rome, a final ignominious parade, before being thrown into the Tiber River. It was a violent, undignified end for an emperor who had dedicated his life to art, luxury, and the soft rustle of silk. The ultimate disrobe, the removal of all his finery, left nothing but a stark, brutal truth. Even an emperor's power could be unraveled, thread by silken thread. So, Elagabalus's reign ended not with a whimper, but with a particularly undignified splash in the Tiber. The silk was gone, replaced by the cold, unforgiving current of Roman politics. But as you reflect on his brief, turbulent time on the throne, you can't help but ponder his lasting, albeit peculiar, impact on Roman history. What legacy did the emperor who only wore silk leave behind? On the surface, his reign was deemed a failure by the Romans themselves. He was subjected to damnatio memoriae, a harsh condemnation where his name was erased from public inscriptions and his images destroyed. This was the Roman equivalent of being permanently cancelled, an attempt to blot him out of history entirely. His successor, Alexander Severus, a far more conventional and traditional ruler, spent his reign trying to undo the perceived damage Elagabalus had wrought, restoring traditional values and emphasizing Roman virtus. For centuries, Elagabalus would be remembered in historical texts primarily as a decadent, effeminate, and utterly depraved tyrant, a cautionary tale of imperial excess. However, beneath this surface-level condemnation, Elagabalus's impact was arguably more nuanced. He challenged Roman society's rigid norms in ways few before him had dared. His open embrace of gender fluidity, his unwavering devotion to a foreign god, and his complete disregard for Roman sartorial traditions forced the Romans to confront their own biases and boundaries. While they ultimately rejected his choices, his reign momentarily peeled back the layers of Roman conservatism, revealing a fleeting glimpse of alternative ways of being imperial. He was a flamboyant crack in the rigid facade of Roman power, allowing a little bit of the exotic East to shimmer through. One mainstream historical fact that highlights his influence, even in negation, is the subsequent conservative backlash. Alexander Severus's reign was characterized by a deliberate emphasis on Roman traditionalism, a direct reaction to Elagabalus's excesses. This shows that Elagabalus's actions, far from being ignored, deeply resonated and provoked a strong counter-movement, underscoring the profound shock waves he sent through Roman society. A particularly quirky tidbit about his legacy is how he became a fascination for later historians and artists, particularly during periods that themselves were challenging societal norms. From the Renaissance to the Victorian era and into modern times, Elagabalus has been re-examined, reinterpreted, and sometimes even celebrated as a proto-queer figure, an artistic rebel, or simply a misunderstood youth. His story, with its blend of extreme luxury, religious fervor, and gender ambiguity, continues to capture the imagination, refusing to be entirely erased despite the Roman attempts at damnatio memoriae. It's almost as if his silk, even centuries later, still shimmers faintly in the historical record, catching the light in unexpected ways. Historians still argue about the true nature of his personality. Was he a debauched monster, a naive youth, a visionary challenging outdated norms, or simply a deeply troubled individual out of his depth? The debate, like the threads of his favored fabric, is complex and interwoven. Ultimately, Elagabalus serves as a fascinating, if perplexing, footnote in Roman history. He was an emperor who prioritized personal expression and religious devotion over political expediency and traditional decorum. His reign, though short, offers a unique window into the cultural anxieties of the Roman Empire, revealing its rigid social structures and its often uncomfortable encounters with difference. And of course, he left us with the enduring image of an emperor, unlike any other, who simply had to have his silk, every single shimmering inch of it, right up until the very end. Now, as the echoes of ancient Rome begin to fade, and the rustle of Elagabalus's countless silk robes quiets to a gentle whisper, let your mind drift. Picture those soft, flowing fabrics, the vibrant colors, the distant caravans bringing the precious threads across continents. Feel the warmth of the sun in Syria, the cool marble of a Roman palace. The grand narratives of history often focus on battles and emperors, but sometimes it's the quiet details, like a boy's love for a shimmering cloth, that offer the most surprising insights into a bygone world. Allow these images to soften, to blur at the edges, like silk caught in a gentle breeze. Your thoughts, too, can become light and airy, untroubled by the concerns of the day. The weight of history lifts, replaced by a soothing calm. As the last threads of this story unravel, find comfort in the silence that follows, a peaceful quiet that invites rest. Let your breath deepen, your body relax, sinking gently into the warmth of your bed. All is well and all is peaceful. Sleep deeply now, and may your dreams be as soft and serene as the finest ancient silk.